Mic is really quiet. How about now? Is that better? Awesome. Thanks, Nick. Hey, Juan. Thanks for coming. Just gonna wait a couple more minutes, see if a couple more people show up, and then we're gonna get started. What's up, Josh? All right. Cool. Yeah, I'm gonna cut that music anyway. Wow, I totally thought Nick B was Nick Boyd, but Nick B is actually Barry. All right. Gonna fade down this music, and I think we are just about ready to get started. Hey Nihal, what's up? Thanks for coming. What's up, Naeem? Yeah, you wouldn't want to watch me on your real account. Definitely not. Don't mess up the algorithm. Whoa. What's up, Jules? I got answers to everyone's questions right in these pages. All right, I'm gonna take off these headphones because it feels weird to talk with them on. But all right, yeah. So yeah, I just want to say what's up, Seb? Yeah, thanks a lot to everybody for coming. Thanks to everybody who submitted questions. Hoping to be able to do this more often. It's going to be difficult for me to look directly at the camera or at my screen or what. But yeah, I basically I took a bunch of time this afternoon and wrote out answers to a bunch of questions people had, and I don't really have a lot of demos prepared, but I can flip over to Ableton and try to demonstrate some stuff if we feel like it's needed. And basically, if anybody needs any clarification on anything, or for me to talk about something more or demonstrate something, then just say so in the chat. I'm watching it. It's over there, not where the camera is, of course. So I'm gonna I think I'll just dive right in because we definitely have a lot of stuff to get to. And yeah, if anybody wants clarification on anything, just let me know. So so one of the questions I got was which I think is a really good one to kind of like get into in like an extended way, and maybe a good place to start is what are the essentials for a beginner trying to get a clear mixdown using a mixing board and a DAW? So I think I'm going to answer this in kind of a general way that will apply to whether you're using a mixer and hardware or just a DAW, or a combination of the two. I think the basic principles still pretty much apply. So I'm going to try and basically answer this with like how I think about all this stuff and some of the techniques that are helpful, that I find helpful. And go a little bit. It's not going to be like you need this compressor, you need this EQ. Hey Helene, what's up? Thanks for coming. It's not going to be like, do this with the compressor or do this with the EQ or here. Like there's not going to be a ton of numbers. I will do a little section of like rapid fire tips, but this is basically just like the principles that, if you, I've found that like kind of studying and getting familiar with these things and learning how they apply in different situations has been the way that I've gotten better mixes, as opposed to like a set of rules or something. So it's not gonna, it may help you get better mixes as soon as you start applying this stuff, but it's also like over time using these techniques and thinking about it this way will hopefully lead you to good results. So the first tip is to use reference tracks and spectrum analyzers and develop your ability to listen for details. So kind of like I just said, like the sort of like rules, like you always need to high pass certain things or you always need to compress this and that, like you really have to take that with a grain of salt because all material is different. So for example, people saying you always need to compress your kick drums or you always need to compress your bass or something like that, that doesn't necessarily apply if, for example, you have a kick drum sample that's already been heavily processed, it may not need compression, but and you might actually be like squashing the life out of it by using a compressor. So or it might just be punchy already, it might not need it. So basically you need to be able to rely on your ears rather than these rules, and your ability to compare what you're hearing in your own track with what you know sounds good in a variety of situations. So that's why reference tracks are really important, because, and for people who are not familiar with the concept or something, a reference track, using reference tracks basically means you are finding a track that sounds good, that you like the sound of. Usually it's a mastered track that's already been released somewhere. And you're basically, like, for me, the way I do it is bringing that into my Ableton session and setting up a quick way of toggling between that track and whatever I'm working on. So it could be basically flipping back and forth from my entire mixdown to this single track that I've brought in from, just my library of stuff that I like. So, and that's the usefulness of that, is that it lets you see, like, well, where is their kick drum actually sitting? Where is mine sitting? Like, what's the, so you're not going to make your thing exactly like what they did, but it just lets you get in the ballpark. And I've found that there's really a tolerance, like there's a zone of what's going to sound right and translate well, and you really don't have to be perfect, you just need to be like in the general zone. Especially also when you're just doing a mixdown and it's going to go to a mastering engineer. I'm not saying leave problems for them, but it is also their job to like give you that extra bit of getting it like to be right and to translate. So and similarly, I'll go into spectrum analyzers briefly too. I've found this to be a really helpful tool, so much so that I included my spectrum analyzer preset in the Trackland Tools 001, which you can grab at trackland.us. It's a set of Ableton devices. So I'll switch to Ableton real quick just to show you. So as you can see, this is actually my I think I need to go over so I can actually move the cursor in there. Yeah, so this is basically my default Ableton session. I typically record just a stereo track, which I'll talk about later because I got some questions about that. But basically, the session defaults to having this track muted and record enabled because I'm going to record on it whatever jam's coming off my mixer. And I monitor through my interface, which is why I have this muted. But I can still see what the spectrum analyzer is doing. So if I grab, how do I get a file without, okay. So let's say I'm going to try and find like a pre-master of mine real quick, and then I will grab a where is it? Sorry, my camera's in the way of the screen a little bit. I guess I need the headphones for this. Okay, yeah, this is actually a pretty good example. So I'm going to bring in, this is one of the tracks from Natural Rhythm Tracks that I just released. And then I'm going to bring in, ooh, shoot. I just realized there's copyright stuff. So I'm going to try and use some of my own music that is not on streaming services. I think I didn't do this. Yeah, sure. Thanks for bearing with me while I set up these demos. I know it's a little bit, would have been nice to prepare that in advance, but I really didn't have the chance. So, okay. So now I think I'm going to turn down Ableton's master just so we have a nice balance. Oh, right. Okay. Gotta set Ableton to use the Windows audio driver. So now you should be hearing that. And actually I can turn it up. Okay, so basically a sample of what it would sound like. Hey Connor, what's up? Yeah, so now you can see, like, basically I kind of ooh, okay, this is a really good question about favorite reference tracks. I have a really big one to shout out. I have been using relentlessly Housework by John Sable on In Dust We Trust, Chaos in the CBD's label. I think they run it with John or something. But yeah, that track sounds incredible, and it has a great, like, it's busy. It has like a lot of percussion and pads and bass lines and all this stuff. So it's a great example of something that's like really well mixed. And so I reference with that a lot. But yeah, anything, you really want to find something that has kind of similar elements or character to your stuff. Although it can also be interesting to reference with something that's not that similar to the track you're working on, because it helps you kind of get, I don't know, it's like a weird, I don't know exactly how to describe why I like that, but it's like you're like trying to get in the ballpark of something that's different. So it almost like maybe it gives you a little wiggle room where you're like, well, there's going to be, you're not trying to get it exactly the same as the reference track, because that's going to be an annoying process. Is the mic clipping, by the way? I feel like it's distorting a little bit at times. I'm going to turn it down a tiny bit. Yeah, so yeah, you can reference with tracks that are different as well. But anyway, so what I would basically do is, like, if this is going to be the reference track, I'll set the reference track to mute, and then I'll have my other track like this. And if you're doing a mixdown and you have a lot of tracks and you have processing on the master, which I often will have a little bit of processing on the master when I'm doing a mixdown, or I'll have just a limiter on it to give myself a sense of what it's going to sound like. What I'll do is set the output channel. So set the audio output on your reference track to external out, and then whatever the same thing is as your main output. So whatever the same is as the master. And the reason for that is because then when you solo that track to flip between and give your ears that perspective, what's going to happen is it will bypass all of the processing on the master. So you're flipping between direct of your reference track and like the mastered mixed version of your whole mixdown. And what I'll do also is I'll go into the keyboard mapping and I'll assign a key like A or something to that. So now I can just tap on my keyboard and I can flip back and forth. And it's really important. I find that it's really important to do that because it's going to basically let you keep reacclimating your ears with something that is mastered, balanced, sounds, sounds good, is going to translate on a lot of different systems. And then you can see, like, you're really trying to get yourself to hear not just like how loud things are, but also kind of like the shape of the different elements. So like, is the kick punching really fast and then it's disappearing, or does it have a long kind of sub bass tail? Is it really like smushed, like boom, boom, or is it just like, you know? So those are kinds of like, you really want to be able to hear, and I think I'm gonna get into that in the next little bit, but you want to basically start developing the ability to like hear into the track. And just to do one quick, like, when you're looking at the spectrum, the reason I like having the spectrum analyzer default always to the same thing, and I don't know what it's like on Ableton 10 or 11, like, are they up to 11? But this range parameter, you can set it to auto, and here's what that looks like. So it sets the range based on what the material is that's coming in. I really don't like this, because then you can't ever compare the spectrum for one track with the spectrum for another track. Because if I set this one to auto, like, it's fooling you, because it looks like it looks like they look similar, but the reality is the bass is peaking way lower here, and it's always shifting around. But when you set it to a fixed range, I've been looking at a spectrum analyzer with this particular fixed range for like at least, I think, 5 years or something. So now I have a sense of what tracks are supposed to look like on it. So so when you fix that range and then over time get used to what things look like, you start to like, it becomes a much more useful tool. And you can identify like where different frequencies are peaking that you don't want, and just what the overall kind of shape looks like. And it's not a substitute for your ears, but it helps, because you're not going to catch everything on every system. And sometimes, like, I'll be working on music for a long time, you lose perspective on your mix, and then you look at the spectrum and you're like, oh my god, you know, the clave is like 10 dB too loud. That's happened to me a number of times. So it provides like a reality check a little bit, which is really helpful. And then so another thing to think about is basically, this is still under the first question about essentials of getting a clear mix down. You want to basically think about how much space you have to work with in terms of volume and frequency. So each instrument or channel in your mix is hitting a certain peak level. So if we go back to Ableton, you can see this is really the way to watch the peak level, and you can see it. I have to put these back on again. Oh my god. You can see it here, and if you click, it'll reset to whatever the current peak is. But basically, and if you don't have these, you need to just drag this up. That's really, really important. But yeah, so basically, you're thinking about, right, every track in the mix is hitting a certain peak level, and oh yeah, I like this question, Seb. I'm gonna when I start talking about mixing kick drums, if I forget to talk about that, remind me. So basically, what you want to pay attention to with the peak levels of different instruments is basically like where where those peaks are hitting, so what instruments are hitting at what levels, and then also like what the interaction is of those peak levels that are coming from different instruments. So if you're making dance music, which presumably most people here are, if you're looking at the peak level of your master channel and you're having big spikes on anything other than the like bass or the kick, then you probably have some elements sticking out that are going to cause problems in your mix or sound weirdly loud on a sound system. And they might not be popping out because of your listening environment, or like the clave thing, you might be like just accustomed to it. Also, hey Taylor, hey Aaron. Yeah, so basically, and those things cause problems in mastering, because basically what happens in mastering is somebody puts compressors and limiters on your track, or maybe just one of each, but those things get activated by large spikes in peak level. So when you basically want the bass and the kick to be the things activating those, because whatever activates those kind of starts to demand the focus of the track. And I think that's a perception thing. It's like, because basically what happens is the compressor, especially the compressor, but the limiter as well, is turning down the volume of the entire track based on where the peaks are. So if the kick drum is peaking, you're getting a slight sort of like ducking effect on the rest of the track. And if things are well mixed and like the mastering is going well, it's not going to sound out of place. It's going to sound it's going to sound normal and sound good. But when you have like that clave, everything else is getting slightly quieter when like the clave hits or when a vocal comes in or something. That's going to sound unnatural, and it's going to lose like the impact of your track. Whereas like when the kick activates the compressor, you sort of get it kind of makes things punchier and makes things groove in a certain way that's actually pleasing, as opposed to kind of causing problems. So yeah, you want to just watch out for those peaks. And you can see that. I'll answer this really quickly. Cassandra, what's up? These are my favorite headphones right here. The Sony MDR V7506. Did I get that right? Yes, MDR V7506. They cost like $85 or something, which is pretty affordable. I feel like they have a pretty even response. It's a little bit hard to hear certain things in the high mids. I really prefer monitors for. But these, I have had really good results like mixing bass in these for many years. But a really good thing to remember about headphones and any listening environment, and this also has to do with doing speaker tests and stuff like that. The more familiar you are with whatever you're listening on, in most cases, that's going to be the most helpful thing to listen on. Whatever you're most familiar with, especially listening to music that isn't your own. Like, basically, I've been using these headphones for definitely more than 10 years. Not this same pair. I get a new pair every couple years or something, because they wear out. I do sometimes DJ with them. I'm trying to keep these for studio only now, because when I DJ with them, they start to get blown out, and then the frequency response changes a lot. It's actually kind of funny. I A-B'd these with my old pair recently because these are pretty fresh, and it's a crazy difference. Like, I put something on and the loudest sound in these new ones was the kick. The loudest sound in the old ones was the hi-hats. So That's another thing to be aware of if you're DJing with the same headphones that you use in the studio and you have to like really crank the gain to get to get over whatever monitoring situation is going on in the club. You're changing the frequency response of your headphones over time, and they'll last longer in the studio used at like a moderate volume. I tend to monitor pretty low just in general, but yeah, so that's something to think about. These days I DJ with a single headphone from an MDR V700 that I used to have, another Sony one that's like discontinued now, but basically the ear cup that had the cable on it basically broke off from the rest of the headphones, so I just used that. It's like the Lollipop headphone but without the stick handle. It works for me and people think it's funny, so I stick with it. Anyway, yeah. So we just talked about thinking about space in terms of volume and making sure that things that are peaking high are not peaking high at the same time. So, and you can check this by just doing like a quick recording. If you're like, you can do a quick recording, or if you're doing hardware into the computer, or you can just do a quick bounce of whatever track you're working on. Or there are some plugins that'll show you like what the waveform looks like, and you can look for those peaks. You can also look at just look at where the master is peaking, and yeah, you'll start to get a sense for like what it looks like when, let's say, your kick drum is like really crushing the whole thing and it's like too loud, because even the kick and the bass you don't want to be like way overpowering to all the other elements. I can't say offhand what a good range is for it to like dip to between kicks, but that kind of thing is really hard to see anyway. I didn't write this down, but honestly I started learning a lot of this stuff when I started trying to master my own stuff, and I'm going to get into that a little bit because there's a question about doing quick masters to play in the club. And once you actually, I would really recommend doing that yourself, because once you start to do that, you start to understand what's up, Low Limit. Once you start to do that, you really start to understand like what is too much and what's preventing you from reaching the kind of like loudness and even clear, clean sound that you want. So that's pretty helpful. So besides looking at the level, you also need to think about frequencies. So each channel, each instrument, each track in your mixdown or on your mixing board, each instrument occupies a certain frequency range, which you can see on that spectrum analyzer. You can also hear it with your ears, and you start to like, the more time you spend with EQs and stuff like that, and looking at the spectrum, you'll start to realize like what certain frequencies sound like, and then you can basically tell without as much trial and error. You can say, I need to pull this down, or I need to boost this, usually pull this down. But yeah, like certain frequencies and what kind of range to use. Nick, I'm going to get into that for sure. That's going to, I think I wrote something down about that. For example, if the kick and the bass hit at the same time, are they occupying the same frequency? Yeah, I actually wrote kind of the thing about kick tuning and bass and stuff. Like, you want to just pay attention to that interaction, because sometimes if things are really close in pitch, they can almost cancel each other out, and then sometimes they're adding too much and you're getting like a huge spike. And these days I usually ask people to send me a new mixdown if that's happening, because it makes it really difficult to get a good clean master. And yeah, the way to deal with that kind of stuff, because yeah, snare and clap and kick is also a big one that happens. And yeah, making sure So it's a couple things. Definitely, like, there's some really deep stuff that I don't totally get about bass, or about like the frequencies being in phase with each other and stuff, and how like it's not always totally predictable how two things in different frequency ranges are going to combine and what peak level you're going to get as a result of that combination. So there are things you can do, like I never really find that I have to do this, but you can flip the phase. There's a switch, or you can use a plugin to do that. Some plugins, like channel strip plugins, will have a phase invert switch, but that's something you can do to help things kind of get out of each other's way. EQing definitely helps, and a lot of basically, and also like I wasn't sure how to best address this in this talk, but using saturation is a really helpful way of cleanly getting the overall level of something to come down. It sounds counterintuitive, but saturation can be actually more transparent than compression in a lot of ways. And there's a really great video by someone on YouTube called Baphometrics, who does a lot of really great kind of like Galaxy Brain kind of like mixing tips. But I would definitely recommend, maybe I'll find that link soon and put it up, but this video about why using saturation and clipping is better for controlling peak volumes than compression. I find that also when things are EQ'd correctly, correctly is rough, but when things are EQ'd in a useful way, and you have only the like essential, because this is kind of what I'm talking about with the frequency thing. Like, you basically are thinking about resolving conflicts between elements where they exist. So getting things out of the way of each other. And the more elements you have, the more you're going to have to sculpt each one, especially if they're going at the same time. The more you're going to have to sculpt each element with EQ to basically remove frequencies and have it occupying the only the space that it needs to make the impact that you want. And it's really important to remember, you don't need stuff to sound good when it's soloed. You need it to sound good in the mix. So I used to leave way too much mid-range in hi-hats, like 1 kilohertz even. There's things like 909 hi-hats and stuff. Sometimes you want that if you're trying to get a really gritty, kind of nasty driving sound out of it. But in a lot of cases you can cut that a lot, and what that does is it gets the hi-hat out of the way of the rest of your mix. And something that I hear a lot, this is kind of there's a almost meme of people complaining that hi-hats were too loud, but it's kind of a thing. Basically cutting those unnecessary mid-range frequencies from hi-hats and stuff like that is a really good way to free up space in your mix, and that lets everything else breathe more. So I would say one thing that I've learned over time is that especially with busier mixes, I EQ way more than I used to. I tried to be more subtle previously, but sometimes, especially when you have a lot of elements, you need to just carve shit away and carve shit away and carve shit away until the hi-hats are just this or shakers or something like that. You can high pass that shit. It actually helps a lot. And then it might sound like, oh my god, I took out all of this sound, but then in the mix you get this it sounds bigger because you've made space for everything. And one concept that's really helpful that I read in this book called Mixing with Your Mind that Davis Galvin put me onto. This phrase, maximum impact with minimum voltage. So basically what you're trying to learn to hear when you're listening for detail in other people's mixes and what you're trying to achieve in your own mixes is, how can I get the maximum impact with this mix, the most space or the deepest bass or the punchiest kick, or like, you know, you want the most emotional and kind of perceptive impact while using the least possible amount of space in terms of frequency and level, like I'm talking about. So you basically like try to listen for that and say, like, listen to some tracks that sound really good and be like, well, how much mid-range is actually in those hi-hats versus my brain is filling it in because I'm just hearing the whole image of the track and everything sounds right, you know? So that's a really, really big kind of concept to think about and take into your mixes. And now for the rapid fire quick tips on mixing. Do as much as you... I'm just going to read these off, I think, because I have a lot more to get to. So do as much as you can with volume and EQ balance before you compress anything. When you apply EQ, keep an eye on the peak level and match it so you can really hear what the EQ is doing. So EQs, a lot of them have a gain parameter on them. So basically when you're working on a section of a track and you're EQing an element, make your EQ moves and then watch the peak level of that track without your EQ on, then flip your EQ on and watch the peak level again, and set the gain on the EQ so that they match. So that way you know that it sounds better, not because you boosted, 8 kilohertz and made it louder, but because you are actually creating a better sound or a better impression of loudness, but you're still hitting the same peak level, because it's easy to fool yourself. And that happens with compressors a lot, especially if they have the makeup gain on. Good lord. The Ableton compressor, it's always too much makeup gain, and you're just raising the peak level of the track when you think you're compressing it. Not good. So, okay. 3 dB is a lot. That's that's a good tip. I always think that's funny. But yeah, 3 dB is a lot. Something good to remember. Basic compressor stuff. Set the attack around 50 milliseconds, release around 100 to 200 milliseconds, turn the makeup gain off, and match the peak levels manually like I just described. That's like basic, something needs to be compressed. Be gentle at first so you don't destroy your sounds. You can stick with like less than 4 dB of gain reduction. And I don't use compression a lot when I'm working on my own tunes, like with hardware. I have like 2 compressors. They're not very good. They're super cheap. So you can get good mixes without a lot of compression. Big tip. Experiment with channel strip plugins to help keep your mixing process simple. The interface of those things offers some guidance, because when you just look at something like EQ8 and you can put the EQ bands wherever you want and make them however big you want and do whatever you want with them, it's not really helping you find the useful ranges to be working in. So channel strip plugins, check out Plugin Alliance. Their stuff is pretty good and it's always on sale basically. So you can get some good like channel strip emulations and a channel strip is like a channel from an old mixer with like an EQ, a compressor, some filters on it, and you can usually overdrive them a little bit for fun. So yeah, having channel strip plugins is super helpful. Don't use too many effects, especially like complicated effects, if you don't really understand everything that they're doing, it's probably going to make it hard to mix. Especially stuff that's like modulation and reverb, like chorusing and phasing and all this stuff that's like doing really crazy like spatialization to your sounds, like especially for dance music, like it's gonna make things a lot more difficult, and I don't think it always achieves the kind of like freaked out like psychedelic impact that people want. Use a reverb send and a delay send. Don't put different reverbs on every track. That will help you keep things clean and keep things in the same space. You can have a couple reverbs. You can have a long one that's like an effect reverb and a short one that's kind of just like adding a little bit of room. Shout out to Andrew, aka Plebeian, from New York, who gave me this tip. Think of reverb as like the pillow for the track. So you don't always have to hear it, but it's just adding this space and softening things nicely. That's really good. Only the kick and the bass under 100 hertz. It's kind of hard to go wrong there. You don't have to be super aggressive like high passing things, but that's almost like a writing tip as much as anything. Just be aware about those frequencies, and nothing in stereo under 200 hertz. You really don't want low end panning around. It's even with all these like mono making things, like the Brainworks has a nice, I really like the Brainworks EQs and stuff, but I find that things are always a little bit mushier when I use the mono maker, that like puts everything in the low end in mono. Really prefer not to have to do that. So if you just write the track so that there's not stuff there, it's super, super good. And read manuals for things so you know what they're doing. That's really helpful. And they will tell you how to use it, which is also great. And there's stuff, even the simplest things, like sometimes you read the manual and you're like, oh, now I understand why it's always hard to mix when I put this thing on, stuff like that. Those are some rapid fire basic engineering tips. I would say like just really do your best to keep it simple and not go wild, and just like I find that, I mean, that's a little bit of philosophical, my style or whatever, but synthesizers like sound freaky. They already sound freaky, so you don't have to go too wild on putting like crazy stuff on them. I mean, you can obviously, and sometimes that's dope, but it does like especially like modulation effects, because they affect like the phase of things. You just want to be careful, because you can like really lose the impact and the crispness and the clarity, and everything just ends up like washed out. And then in the mix, you have to like kind of work to undo that, which again, sometimes it comes out really well, and it can, and a good engineer can definitely work with that. But keeping it simple is really good, and you can get a lot of like impact that way. Okay, so now on to, I gotta try and go a little bit faster, but still let me know if you need like a clarification or anything like that. So okay, just check my stream stats for a second. All right, so mixing kicks, bass, snare, and claps. This was a question that I got from somebody. A lot of what we've already talked about has kind of covered this. So with kicks and bass, using a spectrum analyzer and soloing each one separately, obviously use your ears, but you can also look at which has the louder fundamental to help you balance like that sub bass range, and kind of which is going to be dominant in that area. So basically looking at I'll flip over real quick. I don't think I have a great example to show this on, but you can just look in this like sub frequency range here, and you start to see like if you solo the kick, you're going to see what zone the kick is like punching in, and then if you solo the bass, you're going to see where that's peaking, and those peaks are going to look a little bit tighter and move around based on what note the bass is playing. It's really Ableton Spectrum is great too because it shows you the note name, which is helpful. So yeah, basically if you kind of look at that, then that's going to give you a sense of like which is louder in those like sort of fundamental ranges. And to what Seb asked about with the phase issues when kicks are tuned too perfectly. Yeah, basically what that's referring to is like the waves will start to like the sub frequencies. If the fundamental, the lowest frequency in each of these, that's especially where it's going to happen, in the bass and in the kick is the same, but one of them starts out of phase with the other. So didn't plan to draw phase today, but we'll do it. If I can find a pencil. Yeah, so I've basically drawn, these are two sine waves that are perfectly out of phase. So it's a terrible drawing. So this top one, see when the top one is all the way up, the bottom one is all the way down, and vice versa. So if you play those two sounds together, you're going to hear nothing. It's going to be silent because they cancel each other out because one is the inversion of the other. So what can happen when you have two bass things going at once that are out of phase like that, you're basically going to start to actually lose the impact in the sub frequencies. So that's why having your kick perfectly tuned with your bass is not always a great idea. And you just really kind of, it's something that you probably will feel. Even in headphones, you may feel it more than you'll hear it. I mean, if it's really bad, you'll definitely hear it. But what you can do is kind of move those tracks. You can use like the track delay in Ableton, or you can put a delay plugin or whatever you want. But you can move those tracks around by a tiny bit to basically get that phase back where they're kind of like peaking together. But this is why, like, I think, yeah, it's good to just, it's maybe an argument for not being too picky about the frequencies of different things and making them perfect. Now, on the other hand, I used to make, when I was like, had this sort of like juke and like electro bass phase, like, oh my God, like 11 years ago, 10 years ago, a lot of the time I would use basically like an FM synth as my kick drum, and it would just be a sine wave with a pitch envelope on it, kind of like an 808 kick, but then it would just sustain forever if you held down the key. So that's a way to kind of like, you can make a kick drum that's a bass at the same time, and it's a great idea to tune that. But when it starts fighting with the bass, basically, yeah, a couple other tips on the kick and bass thing, like if you have, like, sometimes you can basically, you can shift the impact frequencies of them relative to each other. So you can say, like, if you want to get your bass line out of the way of the kick a little bit, you can find the fundamental, the lowest frequency of the kick, and apply on the bass channel, apply a little cut there, and then apply a boost just past that. So at like let's say you're trying to get the bass out of the way of the sub, so you cut like 50 hertz on the bass by like 1 or 2 dB or something, and then like you boost. This will work great if it has information there and it's not just a sub bass. You can boost around like 100 to 200, 300 hertz, something like that. And then you basically are shifting where the bass is living a little bit upward. So you lose the impact in the lows, but you can still hear it because you've got more of those slightly higher frequencies. And then the kick drum has that low end to play in and like really sit in its own zone. And you can do the reverse too. Cut a little bit of low from the kick and then bump the sort of like knock or like the punch frequencies. And if you listen to one of my favorite, the 707 kick is a great one to do that with, where it like doesn't have any low end. If you listen to one of my favorite examples is Truth, Open Our Eyes. It's like a Marshall Jefferson production. Super sick. But yeah, it has that where like the bass line is really like giving you this like deep low end, and then this kick is kind of almost like riding on top of it, and it's a really cool effect. Yeah. Another thing you can do is like a really gentle sidechain compression on the bass. So when the kick hits, maybe you're seeing 1 dB of gain reduction on the bass. So it's not enough to really hear it actively, but it does dip the bass out of the way a little bit. And you'll want to play with the attack. You'll want to probably a pretty quick attack, depending on the sort of like frequency profile of the kick. Like if the kick has a lot of like, and then a lot of like really low stuff after that, you could maybe get away with a longer attack on your compressor on the bass. But if the kick is hitting in the lows right away, you're going to want to clamp down on that bass right away. So yeah, a little bit of side chaining. And in general, just to get the low end tight, be careful of like super low lows, like stuff like 40, 35, 30 hertz. Sometimes I get in there with like FM synth bass lines because I do a weird thing with the octave because I really want like the second harmonic and not, or the first harmonic instead of the fundamental or something. So yeah, just when you see those super low lows, sometimes, especially if you get some, like, I would recommend getting like some kind of mastering oriented EQ plugin. I'll get into that later, but basically they can apply pretty clean high pass filters at very low frequencies, like at 12 or 16 or 22 hertz or like 31 or something like that. I'm thinking of like the Dangerous Bax EQ, but there's a lot that can do stuff like that. Yeah, that can be really helpful in tightening up the low end. It just kind of like, it's a very like natural way of getting rid of the rumble, but on an EQ, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that on an EQ that's not designed for doing that. So on like Ableton's like EQ8 or something like that, I wouldn't necessarily suggest doing that. And I don't know how much that's kind of just me, believing in snake oil stuff, but I do think that these like emulations of hardware machines, like it's a slightly different approach to what that filter is supposed to be doing. Yeah, so looking out for those super low lows. And then with snares and claps, it depends a little bit on what the sound is, but the meat and kind of like the snap of them a lot of the time is in like the high mids, like 2K to 7K. So you can cut a lot of stuff outside of that range, both high passing it and like a little bit of low pass even, like, or just a nice cut around like 8 to 10 kilohertz, like way up there, can get that. Like, you don't really need the clap to be playing in the same range as like the hi-hats most of the time. So you want it, and I make these hand motions a lot because I sort of think about the frequency range as happening kind of in physical space in front of me when I listen to things. So you don't really need the clap to be like way up here. The clap can stop like here. So you can kind of like EQ it to bring it down into that zone, and that's going to leave you more space for the hi-hats and make it really just like be right where it needs to be. And same thing, those instruments tend to not need a lot of lows. Snares more so than claps. You want to leave some low mids in. But yeah, and another thing that I've noticed about that, especially with certain sounds that are like heavy in the 4K, 5K area, that's like where our ears are the most sensitive. And when club systems are really loud, those frequencies are going to pop, and you don't necessarily, I mean, you want them to be there, and I actually find that a lot of stuff that I hear like doesn't always have enough in the mid-range. But that's kind of, I don't know, that's a little bit of a taste thing. Like I like a lot of like stuff from the 80s and 90s that had a little bit more in that zone. But basically when stuff is getting played back that loud, you don't need to really like hit people over the head with the clap or the snare if it's a more like kind of one, because it's just going to pop out naturally because of like the way we hear. Yeah, so you don't have to like, basically I'm saying don't mix those too loud. They're going to do a lot of the work for you if you have them in that kind of punchy frequency range. Okay, I had another question about mixing tracks with intentional distortion, especially the kick drum. So like if you have an intentionally really distorted kick, what's a good way to like handle that in the mix? So distortion basically adds harmonics, like higher frequencies to a sound. And when you're taking something like a kick, it's going to have a lot of low frequencies to begin with. And then those, you're going to get harmonics off of those low frequencies as well as harmonics off of the higher frequencies. So you can quickly end up with things getting really muddy and having a ton of mid-range because the harmonics of 100 hertz are like 200, 300, 400, etc. So you end up with a lot of stuff in that range. So I think it's good. A good step is to like play with the EQ and figure out what, like same thing we've been talking about, like what you really need in that kick. It'll still sound distorted even if you cut a lot of that stuff, which is kind of a beautiful thing. It's like a clever trick you can do. Yeah, because it's still distorted, but you've cleaned it up. And that's like sick. Yeah, so I've also noticed sometimes that distorted sounds hit really hard on big speakers. So I think this is like, has to do with, it depends on the type of distortion, but like I used to do a lot of like running drum machines through like guitar amp simulators, and that always like punched way harder in person than I like expected it to. And I think that's partly because it makes things very mid-rangey, but also because it like the way it like kind of basically does clipping and like saturation, you're going from no sound to all the way smushed, like even faster than normal, because you're going to hit that peak much sooner because you're adding so much distortion. So I think that makes the impact actually hit really hard. And I have a hard time predicting that even now. So I find that it like testing is key, and there might not be a way to necessarily get around that. Like you got to make the mistake and then bring it to the system and see what happens. And I'll talk a little bit about different systems to listen on soon, wherever I noted that. But yeah. And you can definitely, this person asked about like building the mix. They're like, should I build the mix around that kick? I think that's a great idea. And I think it's, in general, I've been doing some mixing work lately, for one person in particular, and like have found that building the mix around the kick can be a really good starting point. When you have a solid kick that's kind of like sitting where you want it, that it makes it easier to shift everything into place on top of that, especially in dance music that's so like kick drum focused. So yeah, and if you start the kick in the right place, like where it's peaking around, I would say -9, -10 dB, the rest of your track is going to sit, like when you start bringing up other channel faders and mixing in other elements, they're going to sit pretty much in the right space, so you're not like reaching clipping if your kick is peaking around -9, -10. Yeah, so that's a good place to start. I had another question about side chaining everything to the kick, and like, is that a good idea? Do you need to? What's the deal? So I think one way to look at side chaining to the kick is that it's sort of a special effect or a way to create a certain type of groove, like a lot of like Justice or like Daft Punk or like a bunch of different like EDM genres use this a lot, where like stuff is pulsating off of the kick drum. And I'm sure that's pretty common in like the big room techno stuff now as well, I would think. So that can be cool, and if you want that sound, obviously go for it. But I also don't think audible side chaining is a necessary thing to use or know about in any way, shape, or form. Like, it's just not like, I wouldn't say that's in my toolkit as an engineer to make things like pump like that. I wouldn't do that unless somebody asked for it. Sometimes, kind of like I described earlier with the bass and the kick, subtle sidechain compression, not the kind that you can hear, but the kind that's basically playing a trick on you or on the listener. Like, it's very clever to like get something out of the way a little bit without going overboard, so that they actually know that that's what's happening. So something like, hitting that like 1 dB or so of gain reduction, it can really make a big impact, but it's not the kind of thing that somebody, when they're listening to a full mix, is going to latch on and go, oh, you sidechained that pad to the kick, didn't you? Like, it's not part of the impression that they get listening to the track, but it helps in situations where the pad is like crushing the kick drum or kind of sapping the energy out of it. It basically is a way of applying a little bit of motion to it, and making it like letting the rest of the track breathe more. So it can be a valuable tool in that sense. And part of this question, to answer another sort of part of the question, the way this person phrased it, like, ultimately, if you like how it sounds, that's, go with it. Like, and this is, one of my kind of pet peeves, but we come up with all kinds of words and philosophies and ideas to talk about music, but at the end of the day, like, we're kind of doing things that we like and that make sense and that work for us and that feels good. So, like, it's good not to be too attached to like these philosophies. So like, if there are people saying like you have to do X, Y, or Z, this is like, they're probably going to be proven wrong, if not by you, then by somebody else. So I wouldn't like hold too tightly to stuff like that. Yeah. So, all right. How's everybody doing? Are people still here? People chilling? Looks like people are still here. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm just gonna keep on rolling through these. So I had another question about getting a clear and clean sound when recording, which is sometimes adjacent to the topic known as gain staging. That's a phrase that people use a lot. Oh yeah, I was like staring at the chat waiting for people to respond, but I forgot that there's a delay. Glad y'all are here. Sweet. Yeah, so basically getting a clear and clean sound when recording. The concept, dynamic range, people use this phrase a lot. This is the difference in level between the loudest and quietest parts of a signal. So that's one aspect of how clear and detailed a recording is. And what we want to do is basically maximize the dynamic range, so that you're using all of the available, what we call headroom, or basically space, to represent the sound that's coming into your interface. So a good start and I'm assuming that you're recording to a computer, but this would apply to like a digital recorder as well. With tape, also kind of the same, but a little bit, there's different fun things you can do with tape. So yeah, a good start on this is whatever synth or drum machine you're using, no matter what you're plugging it into, for the most part, it's usually a good idea to turn the master volume all the way up on it. It's designed to operate at full level without giving you a bunch of noise, which is like we're trying to avoid noise as well. That's part of maximizing this dynamic range, is like we don't want that sort of like hiss or buzz or whatever, all the sort of undesirable, typically, sounds that come from gear. So turn that master volume, the master output, all the way up on whatever synth or drum machine you're using. And then so you're starting with the loudest available signal. And the end of the chain, you could have a mixer or some preamps or whatever in between, but the end of the chain is always going to be your interface. And on there, you basically want the input level as high as you can get it without clipping, without going over 0 or into the red or however it's displayed for you. So basically watch the meters in your DAW or in your interfaces like control panel software and turn up until you're close. But you can definitely leave some headroom, because depending on what interface you have, clipping might sound really bad. And basically what we're trying to get to is to have a clean recording that we can work on later. So if we want to do things like clipping or smudging it up or whatever, we want to start with the best, almost like archival quality sound. In this, I'm trying to answer the question, which was about getting clean and clear recordings. So that's what you're after. So peaking around minus 6 dB is fine. Like that's giving yourself 6 dB of headroom. So if you're playing with, if you're going to do a take where you're recording yourself playing with the drum machine, bringing stuff in and out, that's going to give you some space to have higher peaks. But typically, when you're doing your level setting and trying to get the gain on your interface right, you want to be giving it the loudest possible signal that it's going to get. So then you're not leaving too much room for error where you're going to accidentally clip it during the recording. Because when you're recording and jamming, you really don't want to have to think about, oh my God, am I going over? You just want to like zone in with the machine. So generally the more direct your signal is, the cleaner it's going to be for you to work with and process later. So like at the same time, you don't have to be obsessive about it. So you can always try different things. You can say, well, if you're curious whether your drum machine sounds better through a mixer into your interface or just direct into your interface, record it through your mixer, record it through your interface, match the peak levels, and decide which sounds better, which has more noise, whatever. Those are like, you can do those kinds of tests for yourself, and it doesn't have to take a long time. It might be just plugging and unplugging a couple of cables. That's going to like answer those kinds of things with your real practical experience rather than theory. It's going to help you like train your ears and hear different details. So that's a great way to approach it. But but yeah, like it depends, like the quality of the equipment that you're using depends a lot, like, or, a lot is relative to like how well you can hear and how kind of detailed you want to be about this stuff. But like, if you want, I don't know, if you have like a really cheap mixer, but you have a decent, if you have a cheap mixer and let's say like a TR8S or something, you might get a better sound plugging your TR8S straight into your interface. But on the other hand, sometimes cheap mixers sound great. So it's all a matter of like basically trial and error. But yeah, and if you are using a mixer, I didn't realize I had a whole page written on this. If you are using a mixer, the manual will often tell you the best, like how to basically get signals in and get sound without like while adding as little noise as possible. But a basic procedure is usually like, have whatever instrument you're coming in playing as loud as possible, then set the channel gain as loud as you can get it before clipping. And there's usually meters on the mixer, or you can use, if the channels don't all have their own meter, you can use the solo switch, and usually that lets you see on the master meter where that channel is peaking. So yeah, set the gain as high as possible before clipping. Then with a little bit of room, set the master fader at 0 dB. So like where it's marked 0, usually that's like 3/4 or 7/8 of the way up, something like that. Set the master fader at 0 dB, and then build your mix using the channel faders, and watch the master meter. So if you're going over 0 dB, turn down the channel faders, not the master fader. Typically leave the master parked at 0. And that's a great technique if you're using software too. It just helps keep things organized. In software, it may not really sound any different. Yeah. Aaron, I can definitely talk about that. Yeah. So, yeah. If you start to go over 0 dB, turn down the channel faders rather than the master fader. But also when you're working on, when you're working on a hardware mixer, sometimes it sounds good to kind of push the mixer a little bit, and you get a tiny bit of like saturation, which is going to help you control peaks and ultimately give you more headroom as long as you're not overdoing it. So yeah, different ways to approach that. But if you want the cleanest possible sound and you're going to kind of do all the treatment and dress it up later, stay out of that like clipping range. And here's some tips, because we're about to get into if you're recording direct to stereo, like your whole jam stereo output from your mixer into your interface. A few people asked about that. I'm going to actually answer this question for Taylor right now. Is it possible to clip the master channel on a mixer separately from the individual channels? I believe so. It depends on... I think it depends on the gain structure of the mixer, so it varies, because I've had varying experiences with different things, but sometimes, basically, I know for sure you can clip the individual channel by cranking up the gain, but you don't have to, but that you'll get that distortion even with the volume fader all the way down. So you can have like a quiet sound that's very distorted. So you're distorting the channel. If you want to clip the master without clipping the individual channels, or to clip it separately, you would crank, like you could have a situation where the none of the channels are clipping, but you have their faders up high, like boosted. Most channels will go to at least +6. This mixer has, I think, goes to +10. So basically, if you have your master fader at 0 and your channel fader at 0 and a sound that's just about to clip, you're going to be just about to clip on the master. So if you take a bunch of sounds that are just about to clip and you put them all up, or you take that sound that's just about to clip and you boost that channel above 0 dB, then the master bus on the mixer is going to be getting pushed into the red. So yeah, it is possible to get that sort of like squish. How it sounds, I'm sure, varies, and some mixers are going to have different, they're going to sort of notate that differently. The scale is going to be different relative to whether they're actually clipping internally, probably. I don't know too much about the internal structure. I'm trying to learn that stuff, actually, because I want to like design a mixer, but that's still a little bit of a long way off. But anyway, yeah, so this goes really nicely into if you're recording a whole jam to one stereo track, how to get a clean sound coming in. So use a spectrum analyzer and look for huge peaks sticking out, like I was talking about with the clave, or like any sine wave like tone, sometimes on pianos, like electric piano sounds, or like synth sounds that have a very pure like fundamental. Basically a smoothly shaped spectrum is gonna give you an easier canvas to work with later on when you're trying to do a master and kind of like get the frequency ranges balanced nicely. Yes. Yeah. If we're talking about clipping one more thing about clipping the master. KB, I think I know who that is, says, doubt if that's something you can do predictably. Yeah, I would agree. You probably have to just mess around on whatever you're using. Yeah. So another thing when you're recording a jam, something I'll do is like, obviously you can just look at the peak levels and see, look at the peak meter and just see what things are popping. Is the bass, are the bass and the kick bumping really high? Or something that happens sometimes is you'll have the, sometimes you'll have the bass, you'll have a 4 on the floor kick, and then only on one of those kicks in each bar, the bass is also hitting. That's going to spike higher, typically. So one thing you want to do is look out for a situation like that, and if that's happening, figure out a way of controlling that peak, whether that's EQing the bass a little bit, moving that note around in your sequencer so it's happening a little bit later. That's something you can do. You want to sometimes it's just a matter of turning something down a little bit more and accepting that you're not going to have it that loud. Or another thing you can do, actually, which I've done in your sequencer, you can lower the velocity on that note, on just the one bass note that's hitting at the same time as the kick. That can be really helpful. And you can also do a test recording and look at how high things are peaking and what's causing it. You're basically, these are techniques to use your computer to get a preview of what you're going to be working with when you actually record the full jam. And that's kind of gives you that insight before you hit record, so you can make some quick changes on your mixer before you record. Changes that people would normally make after the fact in the mixdown, you're not going to be able to touch the mixdown after the recording, so you just have to look out for those problems a little bit ahead of time. So I got a couple questions, and Josh, I'll try and get to this one about sending tracks to people. One of the questions that I got from a few different people, and something that I'm pretty experienced to talk about, because this is how I work most of the time, is basically like I've made some tracks on hardware and I recorded the output of the mixer straight to a stereo file, either on a recorder or on the computer. And it basically doesn't sound as good as you want it to. There's problems in the mixdown and you wish it sounded better. So what can you do about that, and when do you decide that it's done? This is a great question. So basically, and this is something that I think helps to sort of like, I don't know, correct. Maybe I think some people have misconceptions about what like mastering versus mixing is, so I think this is helpful. I would say once the track is printed to a stereo file like this, like that's all you have, you don't have the individual stems, I would say you're no longer doing a mixdown. You're basically in mastering territory, and those are the kinds of techniques that you're going to want to look towards to use to kind of like improve the sound. Even though you're trying to correct problems in the mixdown, it's basically mastering is the process that you're going through, because the mixdown is where it is. So it's like you're doing a master on a mixdown that you wish was better. So basically you have to kind of adjust your expectations a little bit and your techniques, because anything you do, whether that's EQ or compression or saturation or limiting or whatever, everything you do is going to affect multiple elements. So this is a good time to be subtle and to accept that you're not going to get it perfect, and also just appreciate the character and vibe and energy of the track that you've recorded. This is the beauty of doing the recording direct to stereo, is that you sort of like capture a kind of like liveness that I have found does not really get recreated when you do a mixdown after the fact. There's just something that is unique. So the parts of the mixdown that are wrong or that you wish were better, the energy of the moment that you've recorded that in is, to me, that's going to carry the track beyond those issues. So that's like a good perspective to keep on it. And I could get into how you're continuing decades-long tradition of recording this way, and it's a beautiful, spiritual experience to capture a moment in the studio like that. And in a world where people are trying to make things perfect, you're like, bucking the trend. There's a lot of philosophical stuff we can sort of pat ourselves on the back for if we want to. But no, I mean, ultimately, we're just all making music. But so that's a good perspective to come at it from. So yeah, you would, when you're at this point, you're going to have to you can sort of start thinking about the overall frequency character of the track as a whole, rather than what individual elements you wish you could mix differently. So you might want to ask, is there enough low end, instead of is the bass loud enough? And you can also start to think about, like, if you want to isolate individual elements, it's a matter of finding which frequencies they mostly live in and boosting and cutting those. But again, you're going to have to it's going to be somewhat more subtle, because when you boost, if you're trying to get if your bass line is like an electric bass or something that's hitting a lot in like 100 to 300 hertz, and you wish it was louder, you can boost that range, but you're also going to get the knock of the kick. You're going to get some of the bottom of like your electric piano or a pad sound or something like that. So you want to like be subtle and kind of accept the limitations on what you can do. But that's not to say that you can't do anything. You know, you may find, well, I can boost that 1 dB and it sounds okay. I can't really go much higher than that because otherwise the whole track starts to bulge out in this frequency area, and I don't want that. But another thing you can do is, like, let's say you have the kick is too subby and the bass is not loud enough. You could basically take 2 EQ points, and your strategy would be, I'm going to find that one frequency, that like really tight one frequency that's like the sub, you know, the lowest frequency of the kick, and I'm going to pull that out a little bit with like a really tight Q. That's like that's basically the range that's affected by a certain EQ point. It's a parameter on a lot of equalizers. So you can use a really sharp or tight Q that's like a high Q value typically, so like 4 or 5 or something, and use that to basically pull out just that one frequency of the kick drum. And then you can take a low shelf EQ that affects all the frequencies underneath a certain point and bring that up a little bit. So you're like kind of sucking out the fundamental from that kick, and then when you bring back that level, you're getting more of the other stuff around it. Yeah, so that's one way to kind of like start treating these like problem areas. You can kind of like boost and then cut, or cut and then boost around it, sort of thing. Yeah. So, but yeah, also thinking of the overall character is like, well, you know, is there enough clarity in and high-end presence, as opposed to, are the hi-hats loud enough or something like that? Like, you want to basically think about getting the overall picture correct and not focusing so much on individual elements, because you can't reach in and grab those that much. Yeah, so you just adjust the strategy that way. I would say definitely consider getting some hardware emulation, like EQ plugins. I don't like to suggest like getting certain tools a lot of the time, but you can find these on sale for like $20 sometimes from Plugin Alliance, which I use a lot of their stuff, and it's just like very solid. I don't know if it's like the best sounding shit out there, but it's people obviously have all kinds of opinions, but I've done a ton of mastering with it, and I think it sounds really good. And the advantage of using these kinds of hardware emulations is that a lot of them are designed for working on program material, i.e. like the full stereo mix, whereas something like Ableton's EQ8, like I go back and listen to tracks where I put EQ8 on the master. This would have been like Live 8 era. I don't know if they've improved it significantly at this point, but I would put EQ8 on the master and the whole track would just like sound like mush. So these are models of hardware EQs that are designed for working on this type of material. And the real like secret of a lot of these mastering EQs is that they have fixed frequency points. So if I load up my Ableton screen and I go to the plugins, and let's drop in one that I really like, which is the SPL passive EQ. So you can see Maybe I can find one that's a little bit less confusing. What are the other ones? Well, the Lindell is kind of different. All right, we're just going to go for it. So you can see basically the left side of this EQ is for doing cuts. The right side is for doing boosts. So these knobs go from 0 to plus 17, 0 to plus 10, 0 to plus 12.5. They only boost on this side, and they only boost at these frequencies. And same with the cuts. I think some of these are shelving filters. I think this one is a high shelf. This one is a low shelf. I think those are the only shelf ones. But basically, the advantage of these is that they have already marked out. I'm just using my scroll wheel here. They've already tuned this EQ to oh shit, thank you. I'm glad I flipped back. Let me change this. So if I go from this to this, hey everybody. Okay, that should be working. I'm just gonna go with that's working because I can't see both things at the same time. So let me grab my phone so maybe I can see the chat at the same time as the video. Wow, this is okay. All right. It's really hard to get to like the manage live broadcast thing for some reason. Seems like it shouldn't be. But okay. So here we are. Yeah. So on the right side is the boosts. The left side is the cuts. And now I'll show you just scrolling the mouse wheel through these. So they've already designed this piece of hardware to have to address the frequencies that mastering engineers are most likely to want to cut and to want to boost. So this is like doing so much of the legwork for you, because instead of looking at the blank slate of the EQ8 where you can just put these points anywhere, you're saying, okay, what are the low mid areas that it would be meaningful for me to address? And you can basically dial in like a 1 dB boost and move this around and go, does this sound better? Or is this what I really want? Or do I really want it up here? And then similarly with the cuts, that type of thing is super helpful. And another one that I've used a lot, this is one that has one of those high pass filters in it, and a low pass actually. This is the Dangerous Bax EQ. Basically it's a low shelf, it's a high shelf with a low pass filter at the top, and then this high pass filter for the bottom. So you can just switch through these positions, see what sounds good. It's way faster than being like, oh, do I want 24 hertz or 26 hertz? You know, like that's gonna just drive you crazy and waste a lot of time. But with something like this, you only have so many options, and these are emulations of like, you know, $3,000 to $5,000+ pieces of hardware. My point being, not that whatever the processing in these plugins is necessarily so amazing, because I don't know really what they're doing, but that the interface design alone is the interface design of a very expensive unit that people spent a long time trying to make it useful in the studio. So like, even if this didn't sound that much better than other EQs, it's going to help you work better. So yeah, I would recommend that. Just check out some stuff like that. And always when you're doing this kind of processing, like level match your changes with the original, so that and toggle your processing on and off. So like if you're trying to figure out if you've like dialed something in on one of those EQs and you want to see if it's the way to know if you made things better is level match and then turn that EQ off. How does it sound? Turn that EQ back on. How does it sound? That's like that's how you know what you're doing and how you keep perspective, and use reference tracks while you're doing that too. This is like we're almost in like basic mastering territory at this point. We are. If you do want to use compression, because I've sort of like abridged the questions a little bit, but I'm trying to address everything without necessarily saying what the whole thing was. So if you do want to use compression or you want to be more aggressive with the EQ, and you find that you really need to like, and I've had this on many, many tracks of mine where you have to boost, like you're taking like a high shelf above like 2K and you're just boosting like 4 dB because you just didn't, whatever happened, your ears were off that day and you just didn't include anywhere near enough high end. If you're finding you need to do that and you're going to have somebody else master the track eventually, send them the version that you've like really gone in on, and then also send them the original. And you can ask them, I don't know if all engineers will be down like that for this, but they shouldn't get offended. You can basically ask like, can you use what I've done as a reference for what I would like this to sound like at the end of the day? But do work from the original, because like they may have, depending on who you're hiring, they may have a hardware like mastering setup that's going to be able to do these things in a lot better sounding way, or they may have a better listening environment, so they're going to be able to hear problems and kind of like head them off while they're doing the changes. So like the different, because when you go in on your own stuff and your ears aren't as like tuned in, you might be causing other problems in the mix, or kind of like destabilizing kind of the image or losing impact in certain areas, that an experienced mastering engineer is going to have the tools and the knowledge to do that to do the same things you've done ultimately, but without causing the same problems. So you can basically send them your super tweaked version as like a reference, and then send them the original to work from. If people did that with me, not a problem. Although sometimes you may be better off just sending them, I don't know. Interacting with a mastering engineer really depends a ton on who you're working with. Some people it's like one sentence answers, but they're, they always send you like the best sounding shit. So it just really depends. I would not send stuff to a mastering engineer that you've put compression on the master channel unless you are very, very confident about the compression that you've put on the master channel, or limiting, or like ozone or whatever, stuff like that. I would, just be, if you're going to do that, be really confident about it, because, and I don't mean be confident, like send it to them acting like you're the shit. I mean, you should be very sure that that's what you want, because those kinds of things you can really like destroy the impact of a track that way. I've done that on my own stuff. It's like cleaner the better in most cases when you're like applying this type of master processing when you're sending stuff to people, because they're going to be able to do a better job if you've done less to it. because like mastering, you're trying to preserve the integrity of the original, but make it translate and hit and sound right. So if you send it to somebody and you've already messed up the integrity of the original, they are kind of like, you're starting them behind, basically. Yeah. So, and yeah, if you're not sending it to a mastering engineer and you're going to put it out yourself, this is how I learned to do engineering and mastering, and how I like, this is like the foundation of like Trackland, and why I have so much stuff out is because I did it myself, and I learned, and I released bad sounding stuff that does not sound right, does not sound perfect. It's going to sound weird when you play in a club. I like, to some extent, didn't know any better. To some extent, I was just like, let's just get this shit out because I just want to put it out. I never really wanted to pay anybody for mastering when I wasn't going to make money on the release. So yeah, I honestly, I fully endorse that route. I don't know, I don't know how it's going to be for your career or whatever. Like, it's, people do like when things are mastered nicely and sound expensive and stuff like that. I think there's kind of a lot of expectation of that, or at least that stuff is loud. My stuff was quieter at the beginning. Yeah, so, but I think that's it's a great way to learn. And yeah, let me just read what I wrote here. Because I think I got a little into it. If you're not, thanks, Samurai Jack. If you're not sending your music to a mastering engineer, it's done when you've made it sound as good as you can. At a certain point, you'll learn more by moving on, and you're adding to the diversity of music and expanding people's understanding by releasing stuff that sounds raw or rough or imperfect. Play the long game. If you stick with this method, you may one day have a process where you're just knocking out really good sounding stuff without having to sit and do an hours-long mixing process, because you practice working in this fast and intuitive way. So that's, that's kind of, if I had to sort of like, I don't know, in retrospect, say what I appreciate about my commitment to this way of working, it is that it's that basically, like, I don't really have to sit and do a mixdown, because you just kind of put in the hours and you start to learn, like, you do more. What's up, Tony? Yeah, you yeah, you basically, like, you're, other people may be putting out better sounding stuff than you for a while. But at a certain point, if you put in the hours and practice, you're going to learn how to get there faster. And then it's not, you're in your DAW zeroing out all the faders and building the mix step by step for a few hours. You just have these recordings that are basically ready for mastering. So that's my tips for those who are recording direct to stereo. And I see it's 8:52. We're going to go over by a little bit. But I hope everybody's enjoying this, and I hope it's useful. And if you're watching on the recording in the future, also hope it's useful. I'm going to try and put some chapters or something, so people can click around. Anyway, coming up, following on really nicely from this is I had a question about how do you do like a quick master to play something in the club, and just have it sound all right. And here is basically my super, super fast tips. This is basically geared towards getting things louder and getting a little bit of that like pressure that comes from a mastered track, basically from having a limiter on something. But you're not gonna, you can almost do this by just visually, because you're gonna, I mean, it's never a good idea to do something just visually, but you're gonna basically, you're gonna be far away from the zone where you start destroying the dynamic range and the impact of your track. So what I would say is put a limiter at the end of your master chain. You want a limiter. You want to set basically the ceiling should be like minus 0.2 or minus 0.5 dB. That gives you a little bit of space in case you run just, it's nitpicky like data stuff, but you want to have that extra little bit of space. And at the loudest, you set the release time to 65 milliseconds. Basically, that's a safe release time that is going to sound pretty transparent, but it's not going to fuck up low frequencies. So 65 millisecond release, and then the maximum at the loudest peaks in your track, that limiter should be doing 2 dB of gain reduction. No more than that. So basically that's going to get you right there. That's going to get you to within a decent loudness level, assuming your mix is like somewhere in the vicinity of good. Or like, you know, clean, you have things like differentiated enough and you don't have any massive peaks. That like after 2 dB of gain reduction, it starts to become a lot more audible. So when we're just doing a quick master and we don't have time to like, or we just don't have necessarily the detailed like hearing yet to kind of like really hear what's going on, 2 dB of gain reduction is very safe, but it's kind of getting you somewhere for sure. Then if you want to, in front of that limiter, you could use a glue compressor or the like some kind of SSL style bus compressor with the slowest attack, usually 30 milliseconds, the fastest release, usually 100 milliseconds, the lowest ratio, usually 2, sometimes 1.2, and getting, again, on the loudest peaks, about 1 dB of gain reduction. That's just going to like do a little squeeze to the track on the parts, like those loudest kicks are going to kind of like punch a little bit more with that compression. It kind of like, another way I think about compression in mastering is like, you really want it to be slow enough that it's letting the peaks through, and then after that peak, it's clamping down just a little bit, which means that basically your drums and your transients pop out a little bit more, and the sort of stuff that like sounds, the slower attack stuff is just a tiny bit quieter. That's like, it gives this impression of like focus and clarity. So again, 1 dB of gain reduction, you're usually not gonna fuck anything up. You're usually not gonna fuck anything up doing 1 dB of gain reduction. So that's a very safe level to be at. And if you wanted to, I find in mastering, a lot of tracks can handle a little EQ cut, like 1 dB, Q of like 2 or something, like around 600 to 900 hertz. And then you could do an even tighter one if you really wanted to, around like 4 or 5K, like Q of 3, cut of 1 dB or something. Those are just like little things you can do that I find myself doing a lot to get things there. So EQ, it's hard to make a prescription for because you just don't really, every track is different, but I do find myself doing those things a lot. So yeah, that's like my quick mastering recipe. Yeah, that'll just get you like somewhere you can bring it to a club and you're not looking at like the lowest level file and trying to turn the gain up on the mixer and all that stuff. There's a question about car/club tests, like testing stuff and just checking on different speakers in general. I definitely do that when I can, usually closer to like when I'm trying to finish a project to put it out. Or something else that I find is really helpful. I mean, I already said any system you're familiar with is helpful. Systems that you're unfamiliar with, you should take with a grain of salt, because you don't know, for example, if you listen to something at a club you've never been to, one of your tunes, you may not realize that it's making and you go, oh, the bass is too boomy. The club system might make every bass too boomy, or the room might be resonant at a certain frequency. So, like, unless you're very familiar with the space and how things normally hit in that space, it's just take it with a grain of salt. You don't need to go redo your mix down because it sounded a little bit, like, off in some particular space. And another thing, something that I really find helpful is... and I can't always like motivate myself to do this because sometimes I'm just trying to like get stuff out. I mean, I'm pretty dialed in with my studio monitors now, which is really nice. But I will like put something on a USB and go try and DJ it with other music on my home DJ setup. If you DJ and you have a DJ setup at home, that's a great way to do things, because when you start blending two things together, you're very in tune. I feel like DJing, you know, you're moving around a little bit. Like, you probably spend a lot of time with the speakers in your DJ setup and playing music there that you know sounds good and you like how it sounds in the club. So you're able to like, you almost feel what's missing, as opposed to hearing what's missing. When you're bringing it in, you'll hear like, oh, it's just not like giving enough when I like kick in the bass or something like that. So I find that can be a really useful tool. Yeah, so that's the car club test question. All right, so now I wrote some other... Okay, so that was all the engineering questions. I had a few on writing music and a few on gear. And while we're here, actually, let's talk about... I'm going to do Aaron's question about standing waves and hotspots in the studio. Yeah, I will basically say I am currently in a very small room, and you can see I have some treatment up behind me. A small room which also has huge bumps in the low end at different places and huge frequencies missing in different places. I bought a bunch of Owens Corning OC703 like 4-inch acoustic insulation, and I put them in the corners with some room between them and the wall, which is standard sort of bass trapping type procedure. But I was posting about making these, and then someone I know from Michigan hopped in my DMs with an extremely deep and thorough explanation of basically why these panels are not going to do that much below, like, for the sub range certainly, and even like below like 200 hertz or something like that, because basically those waves are like, the wavelength of a 30 hertz wave is like really long. It's like some number of feet or something. So like, it's just going to basically go around these panels. Like, you can't trap a wave that long without more distance or more like weight between it and the wall. So they recommended that you need kind of like several inches of like a certain type of insulation. I forget. I mean, there's something called a Helmholtz resonator, which is like a wooden box that's built to basically like address certain particular frequencies. And you can put that in a room and supposedly it helps. But basically, they were talking about needing like basically like all up the wall, like insulation, like a foot of insulation or something, because basically you need the like something about like the little spaces inside of this insulation helps kind of like slow down and like diffuse the wave. Yeah, there we go. 30 hertz is 37 feet. So yeah, so long story short, I basically decided to accept that I cannot trust the bass in this room. That was pretty much the outcome of that. So the panels are up. I think they help with certain things. Yeah. So the panels are up. They help with the mid-range and stuff. And basically, I use headphones for the lows, and with the aid of a spectrum analyzer. And when I'm listening on the speakers, I just take anything I'm hearing in the bass frequency, I take with a grain of salt, because I know that there are certain, like, I haven't really done the detailed measurements, but there are definitely certain points where things just boom like crazy in my room and other frequencies will disappear. So I basically would say, like, do your best. You can get some insulation, but yeah, in a small room, especially if you don't want to like lose space in the room by putting like basically increasing the depth of the walls by putting insulation up, yeah, you're better off kind of like dealing with the worst reflection points and just not trusting the bass in there. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer, but that was kind of the advice that was given to me, and I just kind of got used to it. Yeah. I have the Focal Alpha 50 monitors, and I have the bass, like the low shelf is at like -3, I think. So I turned down the bass a lot on my monitors, which I think helped. Yeah. So okay. Yeah, Gladstone says Sonar works as fire too. I haven't used that at all, but Gladstone knows how to make things sound good, so take that advice. Probably worth checking out for all of us. Yeah. Yeah, I do want to answer. So I got a question about gear. That was just, what gear would I recommend for a newbie producer and a newbie DJ, and where to get it. For a producer, I think a good audio, like an audio interface. It doesn't have to be a like particularly high end one, but something better than your computer's built-in thing is a really good idea, and a good pair of headphones. That's my number one probably producer recommendation, is just so that you can really hear what you're doing. I find that really helpful. And headphones rather than monitors, because you can get a pair of these for $85, and I think they'll get you a lot further than the monitors that you'll get for spending the same amount of money. Plus, they don't require your headphones are nice because they don't require your room to sound good, just like we were saying. So I think at that price point, you get a much more faithful idea of what you're listening to. And then as far as like, it's also, I mean, obviously I love having equipment to like do some hands-on stuff. So I would recommend, I would say even like good headphones over the audio interface potentially, depending on what you're trying to do. Never used the Sennheisers, Tony. But yeah. Yeah, I can't speak to that, but I know a lot of people have Sennheisers and like them. Yeah. Yeah, I would say for deciding what other gear to buy in terms of like what controllers might be fun, if you're going to make music on a computer, or like what synths or drum machines or whatever, I think groove boxes are a really good start. So a groove box is kind of an outdated term, but it's used to describe like something where you can basically make oh yeah, Tony, these are the MDR 7506 Sony. But yeah, the yeah, I like groove boxes a lot because you can basically make a whole jam in one piece of gear. So it's anything that lets you do basically like synths and drums in one thing. So like some good options. I really like I got the Novation Circuit Rhythm recently, which is all sample based, but that's really sick. I like the Circuit Rhythm. The original Circuit is really nice. Some of the Electron stuff is cool. If you were going to spend more, you could get like the Digitact or the Digitone. I would put the Model Cycles and the Model Samples in that category. The Korg Electribes are in that category. Yeah, all kinds of stuff like that. Those can be really good starter pieces of gear because you can actually do a lot with them, and you can build a whole track, and then you can record all the parts from it into your computer and do a more full mixdown. But it lets you have this hands-on, like real-time experience. And that was one of the first pieces of gear I got, was a Korg EMX, like the old blue one. And I had a lot of fun with that. And it kind of like, yeah, it lets you get started really fast with like hardware production. So, yeah, and as far as like beginner DJ stuff to get, it's been a really long time since I was a beginner DJ. I DJ'd on Ableton for about 4 years, I would say, before I like learned how to beat match. I used a software called Mix with I think 3 X's. It was like a free DJ program with like a MIDI controller, and I sort of like set it up to kind of teach myself to beat match inside the program. But yeah, I would say some kind of DJ controller is probably the best way to go. I know that there are cheap ones out there, and like the Pioneer ones are probably more expensive, but there's an advantage. If you're going out to play, they're probably gonna have Pioneer like XDJs or CDJs wherever you're going, so it's helpful to get familiar with that interface. But at the same time, like a good general tip is like, if you're gonna buy something, or you're gonna like you're gonna use something at a club, watch tutorials and like check out the manual, because even if you don't get it all at once from watching it or from reading it, you're gonna have some level of familiarity with it when you go see it. So even if you get like a really cheap DJ controller that doesn't look like the Pioneer ones, if you watch some YouTube videos of somebody using Pioneer gear, and then you like read the manual, like just peruse how to do basic stuff in the manual, if you can get yourself to really do that, like that's a good way to like, you give yourself some level of familiarity, and anything helps when you're in that situation, so that it's not like it may be the first time you're seeing it in person, but you at least have seen some of the basic functions and how people kind of move when they're using it and stuff like that. It kind of like primes you a little bit. I think it's like really helpful to do that. So yeah, I'm sorry I can't give more advice on specific like DJ stuff to get. I just haven't ever really had like a DJ controller or something. But I would definitely recommend that route rather than spending a ton of money on turntables or CDJs and a mixer and all that stuff. And the question also included where to get that stuff. So I would say if you're buying stuff new, you can buy from like Guitar Center. Taylor adds, there's also something to be said for getting comfortable with Rekordbox for eventually graduating to XDJs or CDJs. Totally. And you can, even without any Pioneer equipment, you can use Rekordbox to prepare your tracks. I don't, so I can't really speak on it. I just put the files on the USB, like it's, the dark ages. But yeah, definitely. And Rekordbox is free. You don't need any like hardware special thing to use that. So, yeah. But yeah, as far as where to get stuff, Guitar Center is an option. Sweetwater is an option. Like Thomann, Thomann, is another one. They ship from overseas, but depending on what you're getting, sometimes it's a good idea. So there's also some smaller, there's like Perfect Circuit Audio. So those are a few places to grab stuff if you're buying new. If you're buying used, you can buy on eBay. You can buy on Reverb. Nick B adds, Sweetwater is better than Guitar Center in terms of customer service, but if you'd like to mess with some gear in person, you can go to Guitar Center and then go home to order it. Highly recommended. Use Guitar Center for that, for sure. I like to do that sometimes just for fun, although Guitar Centers are less fun than they used to be, I feel like. But, maybe I just live around bad Guitar Centers now. But yeah, Sweetwater is cool because they will they assign you like a sales engineer, they call them, but it's basically a person you can get on the phone whenever and like ask them about what you need. And I have friends who place orders through their sales engineer. So yeah, that can be useful, especially if you're just starting out and you need, obviously their function is to try to sell you stuff, so they will try to sell you stuff, but it can also be helpful to get like basic questions answered from them. And I have called and asked questions about stuff before. So as far as used stuff, Nihal just said pick up the flow. That's a great group on Facebook, set up by Selwa Bergsonis. That's great sort of like community resource for trading and buying stuff. I've done that before. Had great experiences. I think everyone's very accountable and respectful there. You can like check your local Craigslist listings sometimes, especially if you don't live in a major city, but even if you do, you can find really good deals on Craigslist. Like living in the Midwest, especially in Pittsburgh, like people don't want, like a lot of people just don't want electronic music stuff, so they will just like they'll put it up and then the price will go down and the price will go down and then it'll go down again and then you send them an email and you meet up and get it. So there can be an advantage depending on where you live to like you can pick up some good stuff. And you can always like I try to meet up, obviously be safe, bring a friend, or meet up in a very public space. You can find places with outlets where you can plug in and test stuff. That's an advantage of buying used in person. And Guitar Center also has used stuff, as does Sweetwater. They have like a used section now. Reverb.com is a big marketplace for used gear, and eBay. But one of the downsides with especially eBay I've found is that people don't, and this goes more for like studio gear, I guess, but even for controllers or whatever, people don't always know what they're doing and they don't always know how to fully test something. So sometimes, I would say a lot of the time when I buy stuff, there's something wrong with it that the seller didn't mention. I also buy really old crap all the time, so partly a function of that, I'm sure. But yeah, it's good to just be prepared for maybe you're going to want to return something. Maybe you can get them to give you a partial refund, but it is a little bit of a crapshoot buying used gear online sometimes. Yeah. There was also, yeah, I think that's good for all that. So yeah, I had a question about, oh yeah, Taylor also mentioned there's a couple synth-specific buying and selling Facebook groups, even synth-specific buying and selling Facebook groups in Portland and Seattle that are great for used gear. Yeah, Facebook Marketplace, I actually don't go on enough, but that's, I think, another resource. I know M-Gun is pretty active on Facebook Marketplace. I don't want to blow up his spot, but he grabs some good deals on there that I've seen. So yeah, that's another way, especially to find stuff locally, and these different, specific buying and selling groups. There might be some in your area. So I want to get on to, I had a couple DJ questions. The easiest and fastest method to learn how to beat match. I would say basically start, and I'm sure people can chime in with some good tips because it's been a long time since I kind of did this, and I'll try to remember. I feel like I slipped into it somehow without having an aha moment with it exactly, but definitely use a BPM counter, like a site or app, to help guide you with when you're starting to try to mix some tracks, so that okay, I'm blending this track that's at 120 with this track that's at 122. So I know I'm going to have to bring the 122 track down a little bit. That's just a quick way to sort of, you don't have to break out the calculator, but just give you a sense that a little bit what you're doing, and get you in the ballpark. And basically practice kind of just listening to two records at the same time and getting them to sync up, and just kind of moving the record around cleanly, without making the needle jump, and adjusting the pitch fader and listening to how fast it how fast things speed up and slow down, just getting a sense of the feel of it, and also practicing giving the record a tiny push at the beginning, when you line up that kick drum in your Q headphone, giving it, you can do it, with no other deck playing, just coming out of your speakers. Practice giving a little push to the record when you're letting it go, so that you get a cleaner start. That's going to help you kind of hear how much things are drifting. Nihal says 2 copies of the same record. Excellent way to do it, for sure. Because then you're going to really be able to hear when you're slowing down, speeding up. Taylor says picking tracks without swing helps immensely. Absolutely. You want to pick stuff that's simple and clear and not busy. Stuff that's made with drum machines. Don't try to beat match disco records right off the beginning. Those are definitely good ways to start. And once you start being able to get things synchronized, practice keeping them synced up for as long as you can also. So something, especially when I was starting to be able to execute blends, I would just try to keep the blend going for as long as possible. Sometimes even just in my headphone. Just once you get it there, practicing keeping it locked in is a good idea. And there's different methods of kind of correcting the platter to either nudge it faster or make it move slower. I'm sure I don't want to spend too long on it because we're already over, and there's a couple other things I feel like I need to get to, but yeah, you can basically like, there's different methods for slowing stuff down. You can pinch the needle or pinch the spindle in the middle where it comes up from like through the center hole of the record. You can pinch that to slow the platter down. You can also drag your finger on the side, like where the platter is rotating. You can drag your finger on that, and you can sort of practice different degrees of pressure are going to slow the motor down different amounts. Or you can do, like another method is to just, I know Eris Drew is a big fan of this, and a lot of people, leave one hand on the pitch fader and just use the pitch fader to get it synchronized. So if you need it to go faster, make it go faster a little bit and then push it back once it gets synced up. Same thing if you need to go slower, just go a little slower and then go back a little bit more towards where you were. For making it go faster, you can push around the inside of the record, which I do sometimes. You can grab the spindle and twist it forward. Taylor says one weird tip I've heard is turning up your headphones and moving them far away from your ear. Interesting. Maybe that's because the speakers are far away from your ear also, so it helps. Because, if a speaker is a few feet from your ear and the headphone is right on your ear, it's going to be a little bit off. There's going to be a little bit of a delay because the record that's playing, the sound is coming from your speaker to you, but the thing that's in your cue is just in your headphone. So yeah, it might help compensate if you move stuff a little further away. You can also, if you have a mixer that has the cue blend knob, it turns your headphone into a little speaker and makes it easier to distinguish between the two tracks. Totally. So those are some things to mess around with. And just patience too. Patience is really important. I remember before I had turntables that I could really play around on, at the school where I went to college, one of the professors had bought a DJ setup for the school from some old club DJ or something, because he was interested in that and did some research and writing about it. So I was able to reserve time on that DJ setup a couple times and just brought whatever random assortment of go-go records and 19 by Paul Hardcastle in there, and was just just messing around and spending time. And it was very difficult for me to get anything going in some of those early sessions. But then over time, I had a little bit more access to turntables. I used to go over to friends' houses, this is tying in kind of with what Nihal says. For purposes of learning, I do think watching other experienced vinyl DJs is helpful. Everyone's got their own preferences for how they pitch bend or make other adjustments. Yeah. I would actually go to... and I'd caution against thinking one practice reigns supreme above others, Nihal says. That's absolutely. I think that's a great tip just overall for all music stuff. Everything's going to work differently for different people. So just figure out what works best for you and gives you the best results. So I used to go over to like Aaron said, pitch fader is great for getting very imperceptible adjustments of pitch, instead of having that bend if you have a lot of instrument sounds in the track. But anyway, I used to go to, when I was learning to play records and I didn't have a setup, I did have some records, and I would go over to friends' houses and we would mix one track each in a 5-person rotation. And I wouldn't recommend that as the only way of practice, but sometimes, I would run out of my own records to play and have to play other people's. And it was a very if you're in an environment where people are not going to be critical or mean about it, which I was, then it's a really great way to learn how to beat match, because you're just thrown into a lot of different situations. So you want to balance that with more predictable forms of practice, but it was really helpful just with DJ techniques in general too. You just like get used to learning in the moment, and kind of like adapting to whatever's going on. So yeah, if you have friends that you can kind of like get in and mix with, that can be a nice thing to do as well. And they're also going to have tips if you need help. Your friends can probably give advice. So yeah, that's helpful too. Yeah, and there's also a question about how I organize my music library. I think I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I kind of feel like I'm not a good person to ask about this. I don't really spend a lot of time on music organization. I basically have kind of broad categories that are not always genres. Sometimes it's like stuff from Detroit in a certain era. Like I have a sort of like late 80s, early 90s Detroit section of records, and then I have like a 2000 onward Detroit section of records, and then probably my most unhinged section of organization is I just started at a certain point, aside from the like Detroit stuff, I started putting just all the records that I bought brand new in one section, because somehow that made sense to me and made it easier for me to find them. But I carried that over to my digital music organization. So like most of the stuff that I've bought on Bandcamp in the last couple of years is all in one large folder called New Records. Which is kind of unhinged, I've been told. And it is. It's not the greatest. So yeah, as far as like pulling stuff for gigs, like I said, I don't use Rekordbox. I kind of treat my digital library as a big record collection. So I just kind of like, the same way I would just flip through records, I scroll through folders. If I need something specific, I'll search by name. But sometimes I just scroll through the folders and see what catches my eye. Yeah, it works for me. In the past, what I've done, I'm starting to move away from this now and try some different things, but I'll basically, when I have a gig coming up, I make a folder for that gig on my USB, and there may be other there may be other folders within that of different vibes that I feel like I might have to play, or I might put all the like vocals in one folder, or like all the drum tracks in one folder, stuff like that. Or another nice chaotic folder I made was, I just called it The Style, and it was basically like a bunch of like Burrell Brothers tracks and kind of like cheeky like early 90s New York stuff. So it's just, I have a very fluid kind of like whatever makes sense to me, and I think it's fun to do it that way. I copy the files from my hard drive onto the USB, or usually what I'll do is I'll build the folder on my desktop. Like I'll create a folder on the desktop on my computer and copy the files from my main library folder into that folder, and then I'll put that on the USB, and then they kind of kick around on the USB, and eventually I delete them. But I still have stuff from gigs that were like 3 years ago on some of these sticks. Yeah, I have like 128 gig USB sticks, and I use AIFF files, usually 16 or 24, usually 24-bit at this point. Yeah. So yeah, I'm trying to move to more of an organization scheme where things are sorted. Things on the USB are not so much sorted by gig as by the sections that make sense to me, similar to my record collection. But with this new records thing, I have to find a way of categorizing, more recent music more effectively. So I'm going to work on that. But yeah, trying to basically like, I feel like I'm playing often enough now that and have enough other things going on between like stuff like this and doing mastering and mixing and making my own stuff, and trying to release things like starting to do records for other people again. I'm trying to move away a little bit from preparing for each gig individually. So I want to have basically the music that I'm fucking with at the current time on the USB at all times, and then I'm just kind of like ready to go and play, and I'll choose stuff for the moment, or I'll have ideas, but things will be easily accessible without me doing a lot of file copying. And because I end up with duplicates of things on the USB, like tracks that I play a lot or I've brought to a lot of gigs, like there's probably 4 copies of like Sea Lion Woman Masters at Work remix on my USB, something like that. So yeah, I'm trying to make that more efficient, but I'm not a great person to ask about music organization if you like things organized. I'm not someone who downloads like tremendous amounts of music all the time. Yeah, shout out Taylor. Yeah, I basically like, I don't download huge amounts of music, so my digital library may be smaller than a lot of other people's digital libraries, so it's a lot more manageable to kind of go through and find stuff. But I also play a lot of records, or now like rips of records. I had a couple gigs in Boston and New York a couple weekends ago, and I brought records, and people kind of set up turntables somewhat specifically for me. I mean, very specifically for me at one of the gigs, and shout out to Nick Boyd if he's still here. And then I ended up only playing like 5 records the whole weekend, so I'm reevaluating whether I bring records to gigs versus just like ripping them and then playing the rips and making it kind of just easier for everybody. I mean, I'll never like stop bringing records out, but it would be like all together, but it would be like maybe I bring them to particular gigs where it makes sense. I love DJing without the big glowing CDJs in front of me, and I think that's great. But if they're going to be there, I kind of am starting to feel like I might as well use them. And I definitely don't necessarily want to make people set up turntables just for me if I'm then going to end up not really playing the records. We could just save the time and it's the same music. So, yeah. So, let's check on how everybody's doing. Yeah. Got about half as many people as earlier. But we are pretty far over. Yeah, so I honestly, I said to myself that I wouldn't go over, but we're here and I feel like I should just keep going. I'm going to take off the headphones because I'm not playing any music. Yeah, so I had... How's everybody doing? Anybody want to just let me know what's up until the wheels fall off? Aaron says, okay, I like that. I like the attitude. Yeah, basically what I have left to talk about is a few questions pertaining to writing tunes. And actually, yeah, some of these I definitely want to get to. I don't want to... I think I've answered most of what people asked, so I don't want to leave, like, 2 people hanging. I should have watched more Kenny Beats videos in preparation for doing this stream. He's very dynamic. Maybe I should be playing music in the background. I don't know. Yeah, so okay, I had a question about how do I start a tune? What's like the process and the logistics of that? So for me lately, ooh, yeah. Nick says, just wanted to speak to a point you said earlier about using velocity to make space for things in a mix. I think velocity is super underrated in how much it can change character and timbre in sounds. 100% agreed. Yeah, you can make very dynamic loops using just like routing velocity to like one or two parameters in a synth. Something that I'm working on doing more. Definitely, yeah, you can unlock a lot of kind of like dynamism in different gear by doing that. It's almost like it's another modulation source, but you have like very fine control over it. And in the past, I'll share one thing from a live set that I did in 2018. I routed like unlinking velocity from level is a hot tip, because then you can use it to control other parameters without making the thing louder or quieter. So I had a bass sound in the D110 rack mount synth, and I basically routed velocity to filter cutoff, but not linking velocity to the level, the VCA, amp level. So whether the velocity coming in was 1 or 127, it's at the same volume, but the filter goes from like really low to really high. And I was using an MPC 1000 for sequencing. So what I was able to do was basically, even though the D110 has no front panel controls, what I did was I could use on the 1000, you can change the velocity of a track from the main screen as a percentage while things are playing. So I would start the track at 1% velocity, and the filter cutoff is really low, and then I was able to sweep the filter up over the course of the track by just increasing that percentage on the velocity. And that kind of helped me like basically build the arrangement of this track in a little bit more detailed way, even though the synth has no front panel controls. I'm not even using like MIDI CCs to change something. It's just this very easily accessible velocity parameter. So yes, shout out velocity. So how do I start a track? Basically these days it comes from I sometimes don't really have an idea even before sitting down. I will just I'll have different gear that I'm trying to mess with, because I kind of have too much stuff now. So being stuck inside will do that to you, I guess. So I'm trying to get deep and learn different pieces of gear. So, but even this would happen when I had less. I would not necessarily have an idea when I started out, but I would just sit down and start messing around on something until I started to hear something that I liked. So it's very fluid and improvisational, and just kind of letting it happen. I feel like recently I'm on this kick where I'm kind of against trying to do things with making music. So it's just letting it be very organic, and kind of just seeing what comes out. I'll basically have I'm more working off a framework of several different things, different pieces of gear that are connected to each other. I'll have a certain MIDI routing, and I'm using a certain thing for the sequencing, and I'm using a couple synths and a drum machine or something, and I'm just gonna enjoy I'm choosing those things based on, partly I want to learn them, learning things and seeing if I actually want to keep them. I'm trying to kind of get deeper on things and ask is this really adding anything, or is it just distracting me because I'm thinking about using it, but I would rather use other stuff. So it's a combination of stuff that I'm trying to get more familiar with, and then just I think I will enjoy the aesthetic like tactile experience of using whatever thing X. So whether that's like, that could be a particular drum machine, it could be a synth, whatever, like I'm basically picking stuff based on that and just like kind of letting it happen. Yeah, so that's kind of how I get started. It could be a drum like idea, it could be a synth idea. There's not I don't really have like a hard and fast way of doing it. Yeah. And yeah, sort of like following on from that was a question about arranging, because this person who was asking correctly assumed or knows that I do the I typically record direct to stereo out of like the mixer, the main output of a mixer. So yeah, I typically yes, no problem. I'm glad I could answer that. Nia, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Yeah, thanks so much for coming by and for asking. And yeah, I hope to do more of these. And also feel free, like, yeah, if you have other questions, feel free to hit me up. I'm around. Yeah. Yeah, this person asked if I plan the arrangement in advance or if I just feel it out, and do I find myself doing a lot of rearranging in post. And it's kind of all of the above. So once I start to get a set of elements going, it starts to, the arrangement of the track kind of starts to like suggest itself. So like I think it's hard, maybe hard for me to answer these a little bit, because I try to work on like, I try to not be like thinking so much when I do stuff now. But it's kind of like, yeah, I'll just think about how I might want these elements to come in when I'm like DJing, if I was going to play the track out, but also like just what comes naturally to me in terms of like telling the story and how I'm going to get, because I think my stuff has become quite like minimal lately, not like minimal techno, but very I try to be very efficient and like reduce things possibly to a fault. Yeah, I'm sort of thinking about like what kind of arrangement is gonna derive like the most impact out of this limited set of things that I have going on. But there's really a lot of like feeling it out, and I'm trying to get back to this way that what I used to do when I started working more this way was like I would get maybe like 50 to 75% of what I needed for the track before I started recording, and then like in terms of the elements and variations or whatever, and then I would basically hit record and start trying to do the track, and then while the recording is going, I'm figuring out the last 50 or 25% that I didn't prepare to do. So like, or I might have like, you could think about it also in terms of like, I might have a good sense of what I want to do for the first like 1 to 3 minutes of the arrangement, and then after that it's kind of like I'm just seeing what I can come up with on the fly. I've been trying to kind of return to that, and it's actually cool saying that out loud, because I'd kind of forgotten that that's what I have been going for, and sometimes being a little bit like, oh, I should really make this like more precise. But there's like, I don't know, there's this magic that comes out sometimes when it's not, when you don't know what's going to happen later. So yeah, I've been trying to kind of like get into that. And that said, also, I do rearrange in post a lot. And it can be very freeing to accept that you're going to do a lot of that, because then basically, like, I can record for 20 minutes and I don't have to be bothered about, like, oh no, I like hit stop on the sequencer and sequenced another part because I felt like I needed it. But I was trying to do it all in one take and not edit anything, so now I have to like start over or something. Or just like leaving something running while I like freak a sound on a synth, so that then when I bring it back in later in the track, it's a different like patch almost, or something like that, or in a different octave or whatever. Doing like really getting into like I definitely I edit in I edit the stereo files a lot and chop up and move around different sections, and getting comfortable with that has been really nice, because it frees up, like, you can just do these longer jams and then kind of like find ways to fit things together that are kind of interesting, and lets me like, I mean, it can also be as simple as like Taylor and I were talking about this recently, like it can be as simple as just like you do the jam and then you like cut 8 bars when it gets boring. It's kind of like, or more than 8 bars or whatever, you just like, when the momentum starts to go away, you chop that part out and the next change happens sooner, and then the track is going to land somewhere between 4 and 7 minutes, and you got a track. So it's a combination of knowing a little bit where it's going, some improvisation, and then trying to tighten it up at the end in the arrangement. I am interested in trying different things. Like, I know I was just reading an interview with Hieroglyphic Being where he said, which you can ask me at any given moment and I will probably say, yeah, I was just actually reading an interview with Hieroglyphic Being. But he was talking about going to a friend's studio and like recording stems of just various, messing, like using different gear and recording things, and then taking the stems later and kind of reassembling them into different things, or like just recording, like trying to get every sound he can get out of a certain synth, and then just recording it all, get rid of the synth, and then like just keep those sounds on a hard drive to just like go through and reincorporate later. I'm kind of interested in adding stuff like that to my process, because I think it's can add like some more detail that you don't necessarily get when like I pretty much do everything in one sitting these days. So like I'll turn the gear on, start making something, and I don't turn the gear off until it's done, which is usually within like 2 to 5 or 6 hours. So yeah, I'm just interested in ways to still work quickly and improvisationally, but also be like using work that I've done at other times and bringing that in, so that I can kind of get to, I'm not like building from the ground up every time. I mean, I've gotten pretty fast at building from the ground up, but still. So I think that covers the arrangement thing. And I will also say that like part of this, the way this process has emerged, is probably because especially in the last, I would say, like year or so, it's become year and a half, I don't know, I have difficulty kind of making more intricate, like kind of focused tracks. I'm not sure exactly where that comes from. Like it feels, to some extent it feels too like I don't want to be trying to exercise that level of control over stuff, but then also I think it's just like a focus thing, like an attention span thing to some extent, or just, yeah, I don't know. We're just a feeling that it's like, it just feels daunting to like come up with some intricate arrangement for a tune, and I just prefer to like plug 4 things into a 4-channel mixer and just like see what happens. But gee, where was I going with that? Speaking of focus, yeah. So I think part of the reason that the process is the way it is because of this, and because I find myself also busier, especially recently trying to take care of like music business stuff a little bit better. I don't have as much time to like get a full day in the studio, so I'm just like, and even like, you know, last year when I was like, I'm gonna make 150 tracks in a year, yeah, it just like the my baseline for like the pace of what I'm working on stuff at like changed. But yeah, I'm kind of interested in exploring alternatives to that maybe. And yeah, anyway, okay, last question. I didn't plan it this way, but last question is, when do you decide that you're done? How do you know you're done with a track? I really like this quote that from John Heckel that I've read in a number of interviews, I think, where he says he basically he's like, I, you know, write some parts and then I record when I like what I'm hearing. So it's very much like feeling it out on that front. And also kind of like, I sort of address this a little bit too, like when I have almost enough to be done with the track, that's usually when I like to press record. I don't like to like overcook it. It would actually be interesting though. Maybe the next thing I'll try is having more than enough and then just see what happens. Like, because one thing I've been doing also, and this is kind of back to the arrangement thing, but is like, there's a part of my brain that is trying to write sort of like standard tracks with like predictable DJ friendly arrangements, and then there's a part of me that's like, how can we like freak that a little bit so that it's different, and so that it's a little bit more like tripped out or something. So what I'll do is basically like start the track where what would be like partway into the arrangement, or like as in like if I was gonna start, you know, with the drums and then bring in like some like melodic element or something, I'll just start with the drums and that melodic element, or start with some of the drums, or I'll be like, okay, this, you know, these claps on 2 and 4 are making this 2 normal, so I'm gonna, even though I've just been jamming it with these claps on, I'm gonna just mute them and do the whole take without those claps, or I'm gonna just bring them in at certain points, but that's not gonna be like the basic groove of the track. So that's kind of an arrangement thing, but somehow that also has to do with like, it's kind of like I'm messing around and then this moment hits where it's like I can play these elements differently off each other in a way that feels fresh to me, and that's when I like feel some of that spark to get the recording happening. Yeah, and then I'm kind of done when I'm just like tired of working on it. I don't really I've gotten into like kind of reading a lot of like Buddhist stuff lately, and like I meditate a couple times a day and all that, so like I definitely have like a sort of like life kind of philosophy about not like pushing things too hard. So I just try to like keep it fresh, and like when I'm done working on the track and I feel like the spark to keep playing with it is gone, then that's when I'm done. And sometimes, you know, that I definitely apply the philosophy of like, even though I don't always do this, like whatever I record can be manipulated later. So, and I can like overdub on it or cut out a loop from it, or like even do some crazy filtering and build another track around that, or almost make like a disco edit style version of a track that I made. So like there's the recording is not the end, and even when I like bounce it out to DJ it, that's not necessarily the end either. Even when I release it, that doesn't have to be the end. So it's like, yeah, just a different way of kind of like approaching that, I guess. Or like when things are done, you know, you can like stop working on something and then come back to it in a long time. So yeah, I just try not to be too harsh about it either way. And I'm not like, I don't like to like make myself keep kind of like hammering away at something. I do kind of hope that in the future maybe I will just have that desire more naturally when I feel a little bit less like I have to make stuff so fast, and I'm kind of working on that. But yeah, so that's I'm just not really trying to force anything. So that's a little peek inside I guess some of the more esoteric aspects, which I figured I would probably ramble on about at some point tonight. So yeah, I think with that, you know, we only went an hour over, so I want to say thank you very much to everybody who submitted questions. I hope that was helpful. Thanks to everybody who came through on the stream live. It was really nice. Everybody chiming in with some tips, and yeah, I hope I think I would like to do this again soon. I'm interested in maybe having somebody like co-host it with me. I think that could be cool. So there's a lot of ideas. It might be a little while before I get around to doing it again. Couple of months or something, maybe let people build up questions. But yeah, I really appreciate everybody kind of coming through and joining me for this. And yeah, I hope that was helpful, and feel free to hit me up with questions anytime. Thanks very much. I think I should just... I can't tell... The chat will stay for a second if I press stop, right? Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Nihal. Thank you, Naeem. Yeah. All right, I'm going to hop off, everybody. Much love once again. Thanks so much, and see you soon.